Welcome to this next iteration in the Craft of Compromise series for the Henry Clay Center. My name is Dr. Ian Ralby, and I am both a proud member of the board of the Henry Clay Center and a direct descendant of Henry Clay himself. For those of you who don't know us, the Henry Clay Center is a nonpartisan organization that focuses on civility, discourse, and compromise. And while our flagship program is centered on a student congress, both for high school students and for university seniors in the summer each year, we have begun to expand our efforts to ensure that we have a role in trying to transform the current discourse of our national dialogue surrounding the issues most pressing to all of us. In that vein, we started last year the Craft of Compromise series, not just to highlight key speakers who have been exemplars of statesmanship and compromise, much in the same tradition as Henry Clay, but who are willing and able to wrestle with some of the most challenging issues and help us to elucidate the skills and values needed to delve into the most difficult topics that we face. Today, I am absolutely delighted to speak with Secretary Ray Mabus, the 75th Secretary of the Navy. Now, the Honorable Ray Mabus is many things. He has had a very colorful background, and if I spent the entire time talking about his background, we would run out of time before I finished. But today, I encourage you all to look into his past and allow me to just say a few brief words about his background and who he is. Secretary Mabus is a fourth generation Mississippian, and he was born the son of a hardware store owner. And he graduated summa cum laude from the University of Mississippi before moving on to both Johns Hopkins and Harvard Law School. He has had an incredible career, including time spent as a surface warfare officer in the US Navy, and having worked as state auditor, governor of Mississippi, US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and Secretary of the Navy. It's my pleasure to have this conversation with Secretary Mabus today. So Secretary Mabus, welcome to the Craft of Compromise.
Thanks, Ian. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, sir, you have been all of these different roles over the time that you have served our country and served your state. And so let me begin by asking this. We are meeting at a time where the world is in tremendous turmoil. We are largely focused on global affairs at the moment. We are embroiled in all kinds of discussions surrounding things that are happening far from American shores. But my question for you is, having served both at a national level and at a state level, can you look back to your time as state auditor and as governor of Mississippi and share with us any of the skills and values that you developed during that time that you brought to national service and brought into your roles as ambassador and secretary of the Navy that you think both helped you more than perhaps others who did not have that background, and that are potentially helpful for coloring how we approach the problems we face today?
Sure. Well, the state auditor in Mississippi is an elected position. And I had never had an accounting course, but decided to run for it because it seemed like one of the most powerful offices I'd ever seen. And my father, I'm an only child, I revered my father. He tried everything he could to talk me out of running. But once he figured out he couldn't, he gave me a couple of pieces of advice, the most important one of which he said, be honest. And he said, not just honest in terms of don't lie, cheat, steal, but obviously not that. But he said, be honest with yourself and your constituents. Don't tell yourself you're doing something for the right reason when deep down you know you're not. So I think that was, regardless of what I've had, that was the most important piece of advice I've ever gotten. But the other things that I learned as auditor, as governor, number one, you have to narrow your focus. Mississippi is the poorest state in the nation. And when I was governor, every day that I got up, there were about 1,000 things I could try to do to make life better. But if I tried to do that, to do all of them, I was going to fail at all of them. And this is really hard to do, to narrow your focus. As state auditor, I learned to find the job as you want to define it, not as others have defined it. I made it into a prosecutorial job. And over 4 years, the FBI and I put almost 20% of county officials in jail in Mississippi for corruption. Third is communicate, just over and over and over again. This is what I'm trying to do. This is why I'm trying to do it. And this is how it will affect you as an individual or you as a group. And so those lessons that you learn, and a lot of times I learned them the hard way as both auditor, but then particularly as governor, I think really held me in great stead. And finally, I came up with the two things you never want to hear from anybody, which is, we tried that once before and it didn't work, or that's not the way we do things here. Always take a fresh look at things. It's somebody decided it was the way you did it, and if it was decided, it can be changed.
I think from my perspective, as somebody who has worked in maritime security throughout my career, I actually can see those lessons put to practice by your time as SecNav. It is actually remarkable hearing you say that, because one of the things that you did that was really distinctive in that role was that you brought a focus to a part of the world that is often overlooked, the Gulf of Guinea, West and Central Africa. And I have to say, what you did there is continuing to pay incredible dividends and has positioned the United States in a way it isn't really positioned almost anywhere else in quite the same dynamic. And I commend you for it, first of all. But I want to ask, what brought you to that point of limiting focus and trying to accomplish something that maybe hadn't really gotten a good or fresh look in a while? What made you focus on West and Central Africa?
When I came in as secretary, it had been 37 years since I had served in the Navy. And I really didn't have much of a clue as to what the issues that faced the Navy, either internally in the Pentagon and Congress or worldwide. What was our mission? And but the great benefit of that, I thought, was it allowed me to take a fresh look at things. And so the Navy and Marine Corps are expeditionary services. When they're doing their job, they're a long way from home. People have likened them to the cop on the beat. They're always there. The Army and the Air Force, which we need a great Army and a great Air Force, but they're more like firefighters. They stay in the firehouse, they go out and train, and when there's a big fire, they go to it. But there are no permanent homecomings for sailors or Marines. And so as I was looking around the globe and getting briefed about threat vectors and things like that, obviously the Pacific was very important. And that was when President Obama did the rebalance to the Pacific. But past that, when you looked at Africa, particularly the Gulf of Guinea and the Western African coastal nations, everything was going in the wrong direction. So illegal fishing was up, transnational crime was up, piracy was up, smuggling of people and drugs and arms were up. And you look on shore, and terror was moving from east to west. So you saw terrorist groups recruiting more and more in that West African region. And it seemed to me, and still does, that what happens there is not confined to the Gulf of Guinea. What happens there is going to have global implications, not just regional implications. And the final thing is, this was one place that narrowing your focus, you really could make a difference, because you've got 19 countries that surround the Gulf of Guinea. None of them is big enough to have the capability or the capacity to address these issues alone. And the only way you were going to begin to make a dent, begin to move the needle on some of these really crucial things, and I missed a big one, climate change, particularly in that part of the world, and the immigration, the forced immigration that people, because they couldn't grow food or because of constant flooding or drought or whatever. And so by going in and treating that as a region and having the American Navy go in, and what we did was we tried to act as a facilitator and a coordinator. We gave every nation along the Gulf of Guinea radars, a lot of which had been repurposed from Afghanistan as we were moving out of there. But then we helped set up a fusion center in Senegal so that all this information that was coming would flow to one place. And we, as the U.S., furnished the satellite picture so that they could get a read of the whole situation. And then we ran some exercises. Obangambi Express is a yearly exercise, and the first one that we did after this initiative was called Turn on the Lights. Everybody turn on your radar. Everybody connect to the fusion center. And there were other things that were happening in a lot of these countries. The internal communications just weren't there. The fisheries people had one set of responsibilities. Law enforcement had another. The maritime had another, and they weren't talking to each other. And so we sent in a team from NAVAF, Navy Africa, into Gabon as just a template, and set up. Here's what each of you need to know internally, and it began to pay dividends. There was a piracy incident that took place, and it was seen by one of the radars, but then they fled across an international boundary at sea. Before, that would have been game over, but then the second country, it was Benin, Togo, Cameroon. The second country, it got passed to them and on to the third country as they attempted to flee, and they were finally intercepted. And so, I said, you need to communicate. And that was one of the areas that we worked on the hardest, was sharing this information. And then we put together two conferences, one of ambassadors from the region in Washington, in the Navy Yard, and just talk to them about what we were doing and why we were doing it and the results that we hope to achieve to take back to their governments. But then we, at Annapolis, had a really big conference of all 19 nations. A lot of them sent their Minister of Defense, their head of Navy, their head of Coast Guard. And it was a 3-day conference, and people just got to know each other. And there's a saying, you can surge people, you can surge equipment, what you cannot surge trust. And they got to know each other and how they operated and some of the gaps that remained, and various countries or the U.S. were beginning to fill those in. And so while the genesis was this notion that everything's going in the wrong direction, the solution that we reached is making sure that all 19 countries, both internally and externally, were all pointing in the same direction and all aiming at the same result.
Absolutely fascinating to hear you recount that, having experienced it on a different level. And I will say that, at the start of your time as Secretary of the Navy, it is not an exaggeration to say that neighboring chiefs of naval staff in that region may not have known each other. But at this point, there is not a single chief of naval staff in the region that doesn't know all the others of all 19 states, as well as some of the landlocked or land-linked states, as they call themselves. And that is very much a credit to you. I mean, I remember when that conference in December 2015 occurred, and the sense of that community building that the U.S. was facilitating was very much understood as being a real legacy of the United States Navy and the United States government. So let me now ask a a question in reverse. So we've looked at U.S. engagement overseas and how we can maybe facilitate intra-regional dialogue and build communities of practitioners and professionals to strengthen another part of the world that ultimately benefits us through greater security and greater commitment to the wider rule of law. But how much would you say, having been an ambassador and having been Secretary of the Navy, does our domestic situation, our politics, our tensions, our discourse affect our image in the rest of the world? How much does what we do at home affect us overseas?
It's huge. It is absolutely omnipresent in what we do overseas. And there's so many examples of this. I mean, you know, when we hold ourselves out, as we should, as the exemplar of democratic government, and why democratic governments are a better model than totalitarian governments. If we are having issues, particularly violence, around that idea, if we're not living up to the ideals of, you know, that everybody gets a voice, that it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter what color you are, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you get the same voice in terms of one vote as everybody else. And if that's seen to be at risk or not happening, then it really undercuts that message, particularly the message that a democratic government and a democratic society is a better model, that you can do better, that your people as individuals can do better, and that your nations can do better. And, you know, countries overseas, it was certainly my experience, followed U.S. government and U.S. elections very, very closely. And what was happening in the U.S. I mean, there were just all sorts of examples of I was in Saudi during the in the run up to the '96 presidential election, and the questions I got from the king and from the crown prince, and displayed a real knowledge. And when I was secretary, I went to Ghana and flew to the north of Ghana and met with the Ashanti Hini, the king of the Ashanti people, who had been a banker in England before. And we had a very traditional ceremony to begin, and it was just fascinating. And then we had lunch, and I was sitting next to him, and he turned and he looked at me, and he said, "So tell me how your best educational program," which I named my education act when I was governor, Better Education for Success Tomorrow, BEST. He said, "Tell me how your best educational program is doing in Mississippi right now." And, you know, to be in, you know, not in Accra, but out in Ghana and getting that question showed that there was, you know, it was a real granular detail. And so we got to talking about it. And, you know, he said, what we really need is infrastructure. We've got teachers, we've got students galore. We're a very rural country, and we need a few schoolhouses. And so, based on that conversation, we got the SEALs and the Army Corps of Engineers to build some schoolhouses in Ghana. But I mean, to me, that's an example of how closely we are followed, and how much people hold us to the standard that we have set for ourselves. And we should be held to that standard. But it is, if we don't hold ourselves to that standard, if we begin to falter in the commitment to democracy or in the practice of democracy, everybody knows it, and it has global implications in virtually every country in the world.
Do you think we are?
I think we're having some problems. I really do. When an election result is not accepted, when there's a violent insurrection to try to overturn an election, when we're backsliding, because I was the governor of Mississippi, which has a terrible history in race relations, but a lot of progress was being made in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Not enough, but a lot. And now we're sliding back toward the openly racist, the openly divisive things that we're doing. And so it's not just our democracy that is at risk, I think, and that is more fragile now than I've seen it in my lifetime, with the possible exception of Watergate and when Nixon and the sort of the Vietnam era and Johnson and Nixon, but that, as I said, that has worldwide implications for democracies, for aspiring democracies that say, you see, this is what happens. And I'm shifting gears a little bit here, but it is one of the things that that Ukraine is showing today, that a democratically elected government there in an independent country has the power, number one, to stand up to a much larger adversary that unprovoked launched a horrendous war and invasion. But number two, that rallied NATO, that rallied democracies around the world to help Ukraine show that, yes, this system is a better system. Yes, it's better when people have a say in their government. And it has raised the importance and the value of democracies, I think, pretty significantly.
Well, there was no way we were going to make it through this conversation without bringing up Ukraine. So I'm glad we've got there. So let me ask this: in light of those comments, we're looking at an unbelievably rapid transformation from a state that I visited just a few months ago and was very peaceful and a wonderful place to walk through the streets without being worried about anything bad happening, to now being a complete war zone. But we're also watching the transformation of a government that was a bit unusual to begin with. You have a former comedian, a Dancing with the Stars celebrity, having won a democratic election, having found himself in the middle of a U.S. Impeachment process effectively on day one of his presidency, and is now a global figure of tremendous significance. And tremendous visibility, who has undoubtedly inspired millions. Now, he has many detractors and many critics as well, but the fact that he has, under such intense circumstances, spoken up so forcibly for the maintenance of democracy and the maintenance of sovereignty is, I think, quite commendable, and he's certainly inspired his own people, much less the rest of the world. So my question is there something that we, the United States, could learn from what is happening in Ukraine for our own domestic politics? We don't usually think in those terms. We are the great United States, the greatest country on earth, and others can learn from us. But is there something that we are watching in how President Zelensky has managed this transition from peacetime to wartime, and is managing to push back against, as you say, a much more ostensibly robust adversary, so credibly and so impressively? What could we draw from that for ourselves?
We can draw a bunch of things. One is words matter. That the fact that, they said about Churchill that he weaponized the English language in World War II. That's what Zelensky's done. He has weaponized words and given a very stirring but also accurate portrait of what's happening there. That's the second thing, that this notion that facts are malleable, that Russia tried to, and still is trying every day to push, that you fight that with the truth, but that this notion that everybody gets to have their own facts. I mean, I really believe what Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said: everybody's entitled to their own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts. You just can't make up stuff. And I think that's a lesson we need to really internalize, because there's too much just terrible misinformation. I mean, it's stuff that you'd look at and almost laugh at, but people were taking it seriously. People were acting on it. And that's the last thing. It's how we, not only in terms of what we say, but our actions, how we stand up for things, how we stand up for democracy, how we settle contentious issues. I mean, there are always going to be issues. You got a country of 330 million people. Everybody's not going to believe the same. But as your center says, there are answers to these things. And if one of the things that Ukraine has done in this country is unified a lot of people, and Congress has acted very quickly, and they were beginning to get the rap that they couldn't get anything done. And I still think that is sadly true in terms of domestic issues, but in terms of international issues with regard to Ukraine, it's unified us. But I think we could learn a lot between how we communicate, the fact that we fight disinformation, the fact that there are an established set of facts that everybody agrees on. I mean, I think one of the things that Zelensky and the U.S. has done in this, U.S. intelligence agencies, they've publicized everything the Russians were going to do in terms of disinformation, so that it's one of those. I think Putin is counting on you going to believe me, or you going to believe your lying eyes, and that has been incredibly powerful, and the fact that he has shown moral courage, but also physical courage. The fact that, internally, I mean, and this is something that I think we're going to get to, but one of the things that in the U.S. we've just got to quit is trying to destroy the other side. You can disagree, you can have great fights and arguments, but at the end of the day, we ought to not try to, the person with a different viewpoint shouldn't be seen as an enemy or as somehow unworthy of even engaging. And that's something I think that President Zelensky in Ukraine has at least tried to teach us, and I'm not sure how far that lesson has permeated yet.
Well, let me ask a follow-up to that. You've essentially indicated that you've seen a change in national discourse over the course of your lifetime and your career, and it doesn't seem to be heading in the right direction. But what brought us to this? What brought us to the point where we are having some difficulties, and how do we bring ourselves back?
Well, I'll tell one story. When I ran for governor, my Republican opponent happened to be a pretty good friend of mine. He was 25 years older, but he had been very brave during the Civil Rights Revolution. He had, at a time when the Mississippi legislature was talking about shutting down our public schools to keep them from being integrated, he had toured the state and said, we've got to keep these schools open. We've got to support public education. And he was the chairman of the state education board when we ran against each other. Now, we fought each other, it was a tough campaign, but we agreed on certain facts. I mean, there wasn't the wishful thinking or magical thinking or just making stuff up. I mean, we agreed on the facts about education. We had different ideas of how to solve it, and because Mississippi was dead solid last in every measure of educational attainment that we had. We had very different ideas of how you got out of that hole, but not the fact that we were in the hole. And I think that's what's happened, is that there's now facts, and I think one quote was alternative facts. There aren't any alternative facts. It either is or it isn't. It's a binary thing. And getting to this, I mean, I'll go to the 2020 presidential election. By all accounts, and there's been so much study done of this, it was one of the most transparent, one of the freest and fairest elections we've ever had in this country. And yet, a not insubstantial number of people believe that that there was cheating going on, that it's a fraud, that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States. And when I say that words matter and leadership matters, that's one of the cases. And the media is complicit in this. I mean, they need to report the news and the facts, and their opinions and stuff, that goes on in a different slot. They're not supposed to be entertainment. They're supposed to give us that set of facts. And I think one of the ways it's changed, I mean, you and I've talked about this, when I was growing up, every night I lived in Mississippi, and so at 5:30, virtually everybody would watch Walter Cronkite on the news. And he was known to be a very impartial, very fact-driven person. And so everybody said, okay, well, that's what's happening. And when he began to question some of the things coming out of the government on the Vietnam War, that's when, it really went south in the U.S., particularly for Lyndon Johnson and in the conduct of that war. And the same thing with Nixon and his, and Watergate, and the fact that he was going to be impeached, and so he resigned instead of it. We fought like crazy about, how to deal with these things, but the underlying inherent facts were agreed to, and we just have gotten away from that, and it's going to be really hard to get back because of social media, because everybody now decides they're a commentator. Everybody decides that they're an expert, and everybody seems to want to come up with their own facts. And I do think democracy is very fragile right now. I think the danger did not pass after January 6th, that if we do not take some pretty strong actions, I mean, we are trying to, I lived through the civil rights days. I watched people die for the right to vote. I mean, Medgar Evers, whom I named a ship, assassinated in my home state of Mississippi for the crime of registering people to vote. And the fact that Black people in that state were just systemically denied that basic right. And then the Civil Rights Revolution opened it up. And people, then it was, how many people can you get to vote? And we're going in the other direction now. We're trying to limit how many people can vote, how decisions are going to be made in elections. And it's not going to, the real danger there is if you have an election, the numbers come out, and whoever's in charge says, I don't like them, we're not going to accept them. I mean, I've run for office. I've had 7 election nights, and I've won and I've lost. But every time, and the time I lost was incredibly close. I mean, incredibly close. But I lost. That was what happened. You move on. You don't decide that somehow the system was stacked against you. Somehow you need to keep relitigating, refighting the last election.
That brings us to the question of where we're heading. And I look back over the course of this conversation, and it strikes me that you became governor during the Cold War. You became ambassador to Saudi Arabia in a unipolar world, as we were calling it at that point, where the U.S. was the one superpower, having seen the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Cold War. And then you became Secretary of the Navy amid the great power competition, as we so often described it, where you had rising powers, including Russia and China, as well as the rising economies of different parts of the world. With what has happened in the last month and a half, and where we are ourselves heading after the last several years, what do you see as our future, both in terms of our trajectory at the national level and our role in the world? And you, as Secretary of the Navy, had a very active role in sort of guiding our forward most visible portions of presence in the world. As you said, the Navy is our presence in a lot of the Earth's surface, the 70% that's covered in water. And so I'm curious where you see us as a country, both domestically and internationally, in the years to come.
I'll take international first, because the Navy is, we are present. We are there, not just at the right time, but all the time, around the world and around the clock. And people don't realize what that means to their lives. The supply chain interruptions have shown a little bit, but from the end of World War II until until about 2015 or so, we were the dominant Navy. Nobody else was even close. And for the first time in history, a dominant Navy kept the sea lanes open for all commerce, not just for ones flying their flags or the flags of their allies. And you can make a pretty good argument that the rise of Asia was because of the U.S. Navy keeping the sea lanes open, that China has benefited as much or more than any other country, because 90% of our trade, both imports and exports, go by the sea. 95% of our telecommunications and data goes under the sea. So even in this age of satellites and smartphones and everything, we still are very sea dependent. And I think our role, because I still think we are the preeminent Navy for a lot of reasons, mainly our people, mainly the way we're structured, mainly the way that that we push responsibility down and that we are not top heavy, but that one of the responsibilities that we have is to deal with these allies and these developing nations and help them and help all countries, not to exclude them, but to make sure that as they develop, as they become stronger, as they develop maritime capabilities, or that they become responsible countries and that they're part of the community of nations, and that we know how each other's going to react so that an accident, a miscalculation doesn't turn into something that's really terrible. And finally, domestically, I just don't know. I'm worried about American democracy. I'm worried that we're not taking it seriously enough. I'm worried that the media is not taking it seriously enough. There's too much, well, whataboutism or, equivalencies that just aren't equivalent. I mean, you really need, as my father said to me all those years ago, tell the truth. One of the journalism deans that I knew had that motto. He said, "Don't be objective, tell the truth." And I think that until we begin to accept the other side, the other color, the other gender, the other lifestyles or whatever, that they're not evil, that they're not inherently bad. They may do evil things and they may act in bad ways, but that it's a disagreement over methods and not a disagreement over basic beliefs. And right now we don't have that. And that, to me, that is one of the biggest dangers since the person your center was named for in the years leading up to the Civil War, because you can read about it and how there was just no agreement on the basic notion of slavery and equal rights. And so I hope that through organizations like yours and people of goodwill on no matter which side they're on, that we can make it through this harrowing time.
Well, I'm not sure we could have had a more eloquent way of concluding that conversation, because you've essentially just outlined the spirit of compromise in very clear and practicable terms, where I think Henry Clay would be very much in agreement with you. I think that we have a lot of work to do, and you've given us a lot to work with. So I appreciate your service to the state of Mississippi, to the United States of America, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today in the Henry Clay Center, and I look forward to our next conversation. But for those watching, I thank all of you for being with us today. I think this is really a valuable conversation about those skills and values that can take us from a direction that may lead to a diminishing of our democracy and a diminishing of our stature in the world, to a more perfect union, as we all, I think, really truly want. So I thank you, Secretary Mabus, and I thank the Henry Clay Center for our continued efforts to try to bring these dialogues, these discourses to light and to as many people as we can. So we look forward to the next in our series on the craft of compromise. But for today, I'm Ralby, and thank you very much.